There are very few cottage owners in our mountains who do not display a love of flowers, but more should be done to encourage the tree planting as well as the cultivation of blooming things.
Susie Parker Stringfellow understood the importance of sowing seeds for temporal beauty during the short season of her life and for the health and welfare of future generations. An early 20th century woman of wealth and privilege, Susie no less felt her conscience pricked by the poverty and suffering of others. She knew that comfortable women had to step down from their pedestals and venture outside the sanctified domains of their homes to elevate the plight of the many. And so she did. Disease took Susie's life in 1920, just months before American women won the right to vote. But her voice was heard loud and clear, even from her deathbed, for there she planted a sapling that took root at Stringfellow Memorial Hospital. And now, 100 years later, Susie's little tree has a canopy that covers 9 counties, providing shade and comfort to thousands as the Community Foundation of Northeast Alabama. Walk back in time with me to meet this visionary woman and stroll with us through the garden path that was her life.
My life began in Mobile, Alabama on April 16, 1869. It was a Friday in spring, a full 3 weeks past Good Friday, which means summer vegetables and flowers were already pushing down roots. I always thought that this was a fine omen of God's good grace in my life, and I always associated my birthday with new birth in nature and the resurrection of our Lord. I was the oldest child of Duncan T. and Cornelia Hickson Parker, born just a year after their marriage in 1868. Papa's father, Asa, was a North Carolina planter who moved his family to Alabama in 1828, taking advantage of the rich black soil of Monroe County to start a cotton planting operation. Monroe County, for those unfamiliar with our state's geography, is about midway between the port of Mobile and the state capital of Montgomery. Like grandfather Asa, Mama's father, Allen Hickson, was also a well-respected cotton planter from Monroe County. Mama was 20 when she married Papa, who was 24 years old, just 3 years after General Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Papa and his older brother, Uncle Jabez, had volunteered to serve the cause of the South during the war between the states, and, thanks be to the Lord, both survived. Uncle Jabez was a lieutenant in the Alabama Cavalry. Papa's duties as a private in Company K, the elite Mobile Rifles, included carrying dispatches. He didn't like to talk about it, but we know he saw plenty of death in battle, notably Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville. While Papa was off fighting, Mama was a student at the Baptist Seminary School in Tuscaloosa, and then in Tuskegee, from which she graduated in 1864.
Deeply regretting that the present state of the country has so seriously interfered with the institutions for the education of young men, we would urge the vital necessity of doing all that can be done for female education.
A.T. Spalding, 1863.
After their marriage, Mama and Papa settled in Mobile during the harsh years of Reconstruction. Papa was one of the fortunate few native Southerners who found success in those years in the Old South cities. He bought and sold real estate and cotton and thoroughly enjoyed being involved in local politics. I think I inherited some of my love for civic involvement from him. During those years, my sisters Lily and Minnie were born, Lily the year after me, and Minnie 3 years after that. I was 9 years old when the baby, our dear little brother Duncan C., was born. We lived in a nice neighborhood. You would recognize it now as the old Dauphin Way district, in a comfortable Victorian home. Father decided to stand for the office of Sheriff of Mobile County and was elected to that position in 1874. Uncle JJ, his full name was Jackson Jabez, was also a statesman. He worked as a lawyer in Monroeville, and eventually he was elected to the Alabama legislature and then to the office of Secretary of State.
Duncan Parker's run for sheriff followed his only business failure as a partner in the cotton merchant firm C.E. Timms & Company. Part of his interest in the sheriff's office may have stemmed from the lucrative nature of the position at that time. Regardless, Mobile newspapers credited Duncan as the first incumbent to bring systematic business methods to the office, allowing him to retire from office 4 years later with a moderate accumulation of wealth. A few more successful cotton ventures also helped him reverse his fortunes and settle his debts. From that time onward, his success was continuous and phenomenal, so much so that newspaper editors considered him a prime prospect for election to the U.S. Congress. In a letter to a Choctaw County editor, Duncan politely expressed surprise and honor at the consideration, which he then declined in support of the incumbent. Duncan was not so quick to turn down another offer that came his way shortly thereafter, one from the founders of a new Alabama city to the north, who were looking to increase capital investment and broaden business leadership there. A young Sam Noble and 73-year-old retired U.S. Army General Daniel Tyler founded Anniston in 1872 on the site of Oxford's Furnace, a Confederate iron works destroyed during the war. Like Birmingham, incorporated 60 miles west of the previous year, Anniston exemplified the New South industrial phoenixes, rising from the agrarian ashes of the Old South and settling to nest in the Appalachian foothills. Representing his family's steam engine and machine works operation in Rome, Georgia, Sam Noble came by rail to Oxford in search of a new kind of ore that would strengthen their product. He also was interested in starting a furnace operation in Alabama. The rolling hills of East Alabama were abundant in rich hematite ore and longleaf pines, excellent raw materials for producing inexpensive charcoal pig iron. With the help of northern investors, Noble purchased 1,300 acres near the Chocolaca Valley. While on a sales call to Alfred Tyler of the South Carolina Railroad in 1872, Noble met Alfred's father, Daniel. The chance encounter quickly led to a perfect partnership that married Noble's business acumen, salesmanship, and knowledge of ironworks to the Tyler family's money and influence in American railroads. They established the Woodstock Iron Company, and its leadership soon included Sam Noble's brother John and Alfred Tyler, among others. From the start, they offered higher-than-market wages and decent housing to attract skilled ironworkers to the area. In return, the workers voted in 1873 to incorporate it as a closed company town, allowing for the planned growth made possible by the tight control of its jurisdiction. At the urging of Sam Noble, they even voted to ban alcohol sales in the county limits in 1883 to ensure workers were sober, quiet, and clear-headed, and at home with their wives. The new town was named Anniston as a tribute to Alfred Tyler's wife, Annie. With abundant natural resources, cheap production processes, and a stable workforce to access the markets, Woodstock Iron successfully weathered the economic panic of 1873 that proved to be the death of many other post-war ventures. And the 10 years of full control over all the commerce, social, and political institutions in Anniston helped its founders to build a model city. envied across the country for its progressive quality of life. Anniston was conveniently located near a new railroad route under construction by Georgia Pacific that would connect Atlanta to Birmingham, opening up those markets and junctions in between.
Georgia Pacific Railway's regular service to Atlanta began May 15, 1882, and the road to Birmingham, Alabama was completed in November 1883.
When Daniel Tyler died in 1883, Anniston was experiencing its first growing pains. Competition from a new town being built nearby along the proposed rail route and the need for more capital to feed continued growth made them rethink the model. In 1883, Sam Noble and Alfred Tyler incorporated Anniston as a city and hung out the welcome sign to new investment. They touted its prohibition as a major selling point. Shrewdly, they managed the risk of diversification by handpicking a group of wealthy Mobile men to join their development efforts. Among those courted was 38-year-old Duncan Parker.
I was 14 years old when a gentleman from Anniston came to see Father about starting the First National Bank of Anniston. We were a bit surprised at the invitation, for Father had no experience in the banking industry, but no one doubted that he could do it. Father was a brilliant businessman. The offer intrigued Father, so we uprooted our household and headed north, leaving our year-round bougainvillea blossoms and ancient oak trees to set down new roots in Anniston. It was exciting, I must say. Mother was determined that the move would not be detrimental to our education. With recommendations from the Noble family, she and Father enrolled Lily and me to study in the preparatory division of Shorter Female College in Rome, Georgia, when I was 15. I spent the next 2 school terms there studying the classics, science, music, art, and drama.
Susie's parents were devout Baptists and promptly joined First Baptist Church in West Anniston. They were among 45 members who in 1887 organized the Second Baptist Church in the Anniston Opera House. After property for the church was purchased at the corner of Quintard Avenue and 12th Street, the church was renamed 12th Street Baptist. Cornelia was the organist and taught Sunday school there. Susie's religious upbringing instilled in her the heart of a servant from an early age. Her parents modeled the practice of extending their charity to the greater community as well.
Duncan T. Parker funded the Parker Free School in Anniston, which provided cost-free education to the children of First Baptist members.
After graduation from Shorter in 1886, Susie spent much of the next year traveling around the state, staying weeks at a time with friends in Montgomery, Demopolis, Selma, and Mobile.
Miss Susie Parker, a lovely belle of Anniston, and her sister Minnie are visiting the city, the guests of Mr. George O. Baker's family on Dallas Street.
The Montgomery Advertiser, January 1887.
It was during this time that William Whittingham Stringfellow, son of a prominent Episcopalian minister in Montgomery, moved to Anniston, seeing great potential there in real estate, insurance, and other ventures. W.W., as he was known, was born in Hyde Park, New York in 1857 to the Reverend Horace Stringfellow and Mary Muir Stringfellow. His parents were native Virginians, but they moved several times throughout their lives with Horace's ministry.
Reverend Horace Stringfellow was rector of St. John's Episcopal Church in Montgomery, Alabama from 1869 to 1894.
W.W. attended private schools in Montgomery until age 15, when poor health stemming from tuberculosis forced him to continue his studies at home. At 17, he began working in railroad offices in Montgomery, and later turned to truck farming.
Truck farming is the horticultural practice of growing vegetable crops on a large scale for shipment to distant markets.
He parlayed his success in that business into Stringfellow Brothers and Company, partnering with his brother Robert to sell real estate and insurance. In January 1887, he opened a real estate office in Anniston with J.H. Whetstone. Initial ads for Stringfellow and Whetstone cited First National Bank of Anniston as a reference. In addition to selling real estate, they both also sold stocks and bonds. They opened Stringfellow and Whetstone Builder Supply Company 3 months later, and in July, W.W. dissolved his Montgomery business and made Anniston his permanent home. 5 months later, on a cool December evening, 18-year-old Susie debuted to Anniston society in the ballroom of the Anniston Inn.
The debutante system, that's something that was imported from England, and making sure that when a young woman became of marriageable age, that she met the right people, essentially. And so in the 19th century, as you begin to see greater wealth develop in the upper strata, I suppose, of society, they imported that system.
I'll never forget the gaiety of my debut. The hotel had electricity, which made it shine like a beacon on a hill, welcoming all the guests as they arrived by carriage. The ladies were en vogue in the most fashionable French dresses, and the men handsome in their tailored evening suits. My friends and I enjoyed the festivities so much that we stayed till nearly dawn. The Montgomery newspaper even wrote an item about it, describing it as, quote, one of the most elegant entertainments ever given in Anniston.
Whether on that evening or another during the season, the diminutive, blue-eyed belle soon caught the eye of W.W., a 6'3" gentleman with striking blue eyes of his own.
The marriage in the model city of Mr. W.W. Stringfellow to Miss Susie Parker, both of Anniston, was an event which brought forth much expression of good wishes among the many friends of both parties here. An elegant reception was tendered them Friday night at the residence of Reverend H. Stringfellow, father of the groom.
The Montgomery Advertiser, November 1888.
Our wedding day was such a whirlwind. We said our vows, received the well wishes of our family and friends, and hurried to catch the 2 o'clock train for Montgomery. We spent our wedding night at Dr. and Mrs. Stringfellow's home on Madison Avenue, where they hosted a lovely reception for us the following evening. I had much to be thankful for when Thanksgiving Day arrived a week later.
Indeed, the young entrepreneur and his fair bride quickly settled into married life among the elite society of Nobles, Tylers, Parkers, and Knoxes in the industrial city that now included cotton mills, pipe shops, real estate, banking, law, and other professions of the Gilded Age. In addition to his other Anniston business interests, W.W. worked the steel and railroad supply industry with his good friend Thomas Kilby, future governor of Alabama. Eventually, W.W. became president and a major stock owner in Kilby Frog and Switch Company in Birmingham. By this time, Duncan was a director of the Anniston and Cincinnati Railroad, a founder and director of Anniston Car Works, and president and organizer of the Anniston Pipe Works. He held court nightly at the Anniston Inn, swapping yarns with good friends.
It used to be said that if one desired to borrow money of the bank, it could always be done if you had a good joke to tell Mr. Parker.
A.H. Shepard, Anniston Kiwanis Club.
In 1889, Duncan and Cornelia were building a large Gothic-style home at 330 East 6th Street on Tyler Hill, which overlooked Anniston on the east side. It was a prime lot on land Duncan and several businessmen had acquired from the Tyler family estate to plot for upscale residential development. Their oldest daughter and new son-in-law soon broke ground next door on their own estate, a Queen Anne-style manor. But the Parker family's idyllic life ended abruptly that March when 12-year-old Duncan C. Parker fell ill with pneumonia. He clung to life for 25 days, his mother rarely leaving his bedside. After his death on March 26th, a solemn air descended on the city. The Anniston Rifles and the Woodstock Guards, a civil military unit of which young Duncan was a junior member, attended the casket before his body was laid to rest in Hillside Cemetery. The family was still in freefall when Cornelia, withered from her bedside vigil and subsequent grief, also succumbed to pneumonia. She died a month later, on Easter Sunday, 5 days after Susie's 20th birthday. Cornelia was but 40 years old.
And when you think about Susie's mother, Cornelia, Duncan gets sick, right? He has pneumonia. She's his caretaker. Because at this time, people don't go into the hospital for an illness. You're treated in your home. In fact, they often did surgeries in people's homes. These hospitals were more a place for poor people. So if you were from the middle class or the upper class, doctors came to you, or family members provided the care. So here's Cornelia taking care of her son, and then her daughter also gets sick, right? So she's taking care of the daughter, and that jeopardizes her own immune system, and so she gets sick. And then so she and Duncan die. I mean, the daughter survives, but the two of them die as a result.
When Duncan laid Cornelia to rest beside their son, he buried a large part of his own spirit with them. With the energy he had left, he set about honoring their legacy through religious and charitable endeavors and focusing on his growing business interests. His main focus was launching another Woodstock Iron Works operation south of Birmingham in Shelby, Alabama. Like Anniston, Shelby was rich in iron ore beds and timberland, the proven combination for a successful New South city. Investors in the prospective venture included a who's who list of the well-to-do Annistonians and Mobilians. At the same time, 12th Street Baptist Church was constructing its impressive Gothic-style building. Duncan contributed $75,000, that's about $2.1 million today, to build the sanctuary in memory of his wife and son. Built out of Kentucky bluestone and native pink sandstone pulled from nearby Rocky Hollow Quarry. The church's sanctuary would contain pews hewn from native oak and would seat 750 worshipers. It was soon rechristened Parker Memorial Baptist Church, although Duncan would not be there for the dedication.
I look back on 1889 with bittersweet memories. Mr. Stringfellow and I began the year with such grand plans. We were building our first home with family and dear friends living nearby, and my husband's many business endeavors were thriving. But when little Duncan and Mother passed away, grief overcame us all, especially Father, as one might expect. I imagined Christ taking Mother with him on his ascension and setting her down inside heaven's gates among the Easter lilies, where she embraced little Duncan for eternity. That vision sustained me during her funeral and its aftermath. During the next few weeks, Father poured his energies into his business and the church building project. WW and I busied ourselves by traveling to Montgomery to visit his family and focusing our energies on the completion of our home on Tyler Hill. One nice memory was having my portrait selected by the Russell brothers for their wonderful photography at the Alabama State Fair that autumn. They showcased several of Anniston's citizens, as well as some of our homes in the exhibition. And, of course, we were extremely worried about Father.
Duncan left Anniston for an extended stay in New York City sometime during the summer after Cornelia's death. His trip presumably was to seek more investment in Anniston businesses and the Shelby venture. But family letters and other accounts described him as prostrate with grief and in severe physical pain, possibly from cancer. He seemed to know his own time was short, On September 11, 1889, he used hotel stationery to pen a cryptic letter to his daughters.
In the event of my death, it is my express wish that you all fail not to carry out my idea of the Memorial Church in Anniston and the School for Children belonging to the First Baptist Church of Anniston.
He never moved into the new home he had built with Cornelia, but instead came home to spend his last weeks under the care of his nephew, O.H. Parker, and his wife, Annie. The O.H. Parkers made a bed for him on the parlor of their home at 1524 Wilmer Avenue, and there he died, March 28, 1890. Duncan Parker was 44. 2 days later at 2 p.m. on a Sunday, all of Anniston gathered at Parker Memorial Baptist Church for his funeral. A large procession from there to Hillside Cemetery consisted of all classes of people, from the pauper to the capitalist, reported the Jacksonville Republican. Newspapers around the state reported his death with much laud for his contributions and equal lament for his loss. Mr. Parker's death cannot be regarded in any other light than as a great public calamity, said the Montgomery Advertiser. In his death, the state has lost one of the foremost citizens and the poor and needy a kind friend. We are glad that Alabama has been blessed with the life and example of such men.
Well, Duncan was such a larger-than-life figure coming into a new city. He was the Montgomery connections, the political connections that made this engine go with all the money investment. He also knew how things worked in the South and helped them maneuver a lot of that. When he died, not only did you lose a leader in the community and such a character, you lost someone who invested in churches, invested in legacy, invested in taking care of people, education, and the poor. When he left, you know, it just left that void that's very hard to fill.
Duncan's death came 2 years after the death of Sam Noble in 1888. The torch was being passed quickly to the next generation of leaders, many of them related by blood, marriage, or both, to the founders. 2 months after her father died, Lily Parker married John H. Noble, a nephew of Sam, and one of the new leaders of the Woodstock Iron Company. Duncan left an estate worth $1.5 million. That's about $42 million today, to be divided equally among his 3 daughters.
After Father's death and Lily's wedding, WW and I felt strongly that we needed some rest and time away. So after a brief trip to Montgomery, we traveled to New York and boarded the RMS Umbria for an extended tour of Europe. From our days at sea on the steamer to our travels over the continent, we found the adventure to be both soothing and exhilarating.
In his will, Duncan had requested that W.W. Stringfellow succeed him as the president of First National Bank, a request that the board of directors honored. Thus did Duncan, in death, further entrench his son-in-law into the business leadership of his adopted town. This, of course, put Susie Stringfellow at the very top of women's social circles at a time when that meant more presence in public life than ever before. But her first order of business was to see the completion of the Parker Memorial Church building.
We dedicated the new church building on March 30th, 1891, almost exactly a year after Father's death. My, was it a grand event. Dr. John Broadus, president of the Southern Baptist Seminary, traveled all the way from Louisville to deliver the sermon. I've never seen so many people. The pews in the aisles were full, and I'm told 500 more people had to be turned away. All the pastors of the city attended, as did our former pastor, Dr. Nunley, who is now president of Mercer College in Macon, Georgia. Dr. Battle, president of my own beloved Shorter College, came as well. But more than anything, it marked closure for me, Lily, and Minnie, and of course, it was the day after Easter Sunday. It was springtime again.
Susie found her daytime hours fully engaged in happier activities, one of the first being Minnie's marriage that December to Walter Gurney Scott.
Invitations are out for the marriage of Miss Minnie Parker, youngest daughter of the late Duncan T. Parker, and Walter Gurney Scott, grandson of millionaire W.S. Gurney of New York. They are to be married at Grace Church, Anniston, December 2nd.
Pickens County Herald and West Alabamian, November 1891.
Susie played cards weekly as a member of the Tuesday afternoon euchre club, hosting her friends one memorable afternoon during the Easter season of 1901, a society reporter wrote. The color note of pink was beautifully carried out in the decorations, scorecards, and ices.
So, while their involvement in some of these clubs may have started out as literary or educational or cultural, it very quickly turned into attention to societal problems. And a lot of that had to do with the progressive movement and this idea that they needed to fix the ills of society. A lot of the women who become involved in the club movement, who become active in the temperance movement or the women's suffrage movement, they establish these bonds with other women when they're at school. Right? And so they develop this kind of sisterhood, if you will. And a lot of those women form lifelong friendships that you can see through these volumes of letters that they wrote back to each other. And so when women leave those schools and come home, they're searching for that connection again. And so that's why they join these clubs.
Convinced that a cooler summer climate would be good for WW's recurring bouts with tuberculosis, Susie urged him to purchase a mountain estate in Blowing Rock, a village in Watauga County, North Carolina, in late 1892. They renamed the 100-acre estate Chitola, the Cherokee word for haven of rest. They summered there for the first time in 1893.
With his strong interests in horticulture and landscape architecture, I knew WW would find peace at Chitola. But he most certainly didn't rest. He immediately enlarged the mill pond to 7 acres and stocked it with fine trout. He was delighted to see the young people of Blowing Rock come there to fish and swim. He also imported English maples, rhododendron, and other tree species from Europe. We soon began planning for the expansion of the main house and other buildings, and we spent the next few summers completing the work. My, how we loved our mountain retreat.
Back in Anniston, Susie founded and served as first president of a new musical club in 1895 and was a charter member of Studiosus, a literary study club. The first women's club in Alabama, the Mobile Reading Club, began in Susie's hometown in 1882, 2 years before her family's moved to Anniston. Clubs soon popped up in Selma, Tuscaloosa, Decatur, and Birmingham. Anniston's first chapter, Studiosus, was founded in 1894 by Catherine Hillier Robinson. A former teacher, Catherine led the young matrons in year-long explorations of authors, history, and other cultures as the 20th century approached. In 1898 and 99, for example, they studied Shakespeare's greatest plays. Susie led the discussion of Hamlet in December. Club members included Knoxes, Nobles, Pelhams, Turners, and other wives and daughters of Anniston's upper echelon.
The challenges that they had in that period of time, when we looked up research, we found a lot of quotes in the paper from men about her. But there weren't any quotes about women in the paper. Women created their social clubs and recorded things for that purpose, right? There was another way for them to be able to have posterity in what they did.
While Studiosus members were getting their footing in 1895, older clubs around Alabama sent delegates to Birmingham to consider creating a statewide federation. The Federation of Women's Clubs invited Studiosus of Anniston to send a delegate to their first annual meeting in Montgomery in May 1896. Studiosus sent Mrs. John B. Knox as their representative. They not only joined the Federation, but ambitiously co-hosted its next annual meeting with a sister club in Anniston. It was clear from the start that Anniston and Susie knew how to make an entrance. As part of the program, Susie presented a paper titled The Lying Age, adding new laurels to those she already possessed as a brilliant and scholarly woman. She also hosted an evening reception for the Federation. Dressed in a taffeta and chiffon gown in the studiosus colors of green and white, she greeted more than 200 guests, inviting them to mingle among rooms adorned with rare palms, Japanese lanterns, and Persian rugs. As the club matured and the 20th century loomed, studiosus meetings became less about exploring the classics and more about current events and social issues. Advocacy could not be far behind. Susie's own family had experienced the effects of addiction. A month-long alcohol binge by Walter Gurney Scott had left her sister Minnie a widow at age 22. The young couple had moved to Chicago, where Walter brokered real estate. He shot himself in the chest in March 1895, being crazed by intoxication, as reported in the Chicago Tribune. Over time, the mission of the Alabama Federation of Women's Clubs evolved from purely social and literary to providing a conduit to share best practices, provide mutual help, and, through federation, become a power for good. In 1898, the 700-member Federation's Committee on Education released a scathing report on the state of education in the state of Alabama, which ranked third in illiteracy in the nation, and called for reforms to public schools in the interests of providing civil, moral, and religious progress, and industrial and commercial development. Its call to action summoned the mothers of Alabama, the press, businessmen, and commercial bodies, the clergy, and all denominations, and others, to create a public sentiment strong enough to demand for the children of the state adequate educational facilities. Shaped by her parents' charitable examples, her faith and her social awakening, Susie answered the call quietly and gracefully to become a power for good. She became an active member of the Free Kindergarten Association, for example, hosting a fundraiser at her home in 1901. But Susie's Anniston activities waned as the Stringfellows spent more and more time in Blowing Rock, where they both invested heavily in improving their home and assimilating into their new community. They completed construction on Chitola in 1901, and Susie landscaped the grounds with blooming plants imported from all over the world. A single red dahlia bulb imported from France multiplied 1,000-fold, adding even more international splash to the grounds. The beautiful cottage on the Silver Lake, as described in a Raleigh paper, was really no cottage at all. The 8-bedroom chateau, surrounded by guest cottages, a stable, spring house, smokehouse, and servants' cottages, was described variously as handsome, magnificent, palatial, and the cameo on the hill. In a community fast becoming a summer playground for the rich, no estate was to be its equal. For an August party to celebrate their 20th anniversary at Chitola in 1912, Susie transformed the grounds into a veritable fairyland, strung with Japanese lanterns to illuminate all shades of flowers that bloom in riotous beauty. Topped off with a fireworks display, the evening was one of the most beautiful social affairs ever witnessed in this wonderfully beautiful cloudland of North Carolina, so wrote the Raleigh Times Society editor. While W.W. kept his fingers in Alabama business ventures, his main interests were now in North Carolina, notably in farming and in real estate sales and rentals with his brother Robert. At some point, he backed off of the presidency of the First National Bank in Anniston. The 1910 Calhoun County Census listed his occupation as vice president of the bank. The gentleman farmer took great pride in his Royal English Berkshire pigs, which he bred, sold, and displayed at county fairs. He sold eggs for hatching from his prize-winning stock of chicken breeds at a price of $1 for 15 eggs. His innovative construction and home ideas were shared by Raleigh's Progressive Farmer newspaper in 1911. With his health improving, he and Susie traveled more and more in the winter season. In 1906, they toured the Orient. In 1912, they traveled by steamer to Japan to enjoy the Cherry Blossom Festival. Susie was impressed, but not overwhelmed.
The Japanese cherry blossoms were beautiful, but they do not compare with the splendor of Mrs. Moses Cone's 40,000 apple blossom trees when her orchard is in bloom in the spring. Indeed, we have seen more and finer flowers in Watauga County than in all of Japan.
From Japan, they sailed to China. The next winter, they traveled to Algiers, Rome, and Russia. W.W. brought tales of their travels back to Blowing Rock with well-attended lectures on old country customs and manners. Their travels also gave them first-hand views of poverty and suffering in Jerusalem, Constantinople, Old Shanghai, and London.
Particularly for a woman like Susie, who was involved in the club movement and in different causes, and she was interested in kindergartens and those kind of things within her community. Yes, I think she would have seen, showing the pictures from their travels or sharing that information as educational uplift for her community. So it would be yet another way that she could help her community.
In North Carolina, they supported the Red Cross and a local orphanage, and Susie pioneered a program to help neglected children. They were especially generous to the Watauga County Home, which housed, clothed, and fed the poor and feeble. The Reverend Edgar Tufts further described the facility as racially integrated, with its inmates including a man in his late 90s, a paraplegic man, and a blind woman. Clearly, these poor souls touched the hearts of Susie and W.W.
In behalf of those appreciative people and ladies of the village, wishes to heartily thank Mr. and Mrs. Stringfellow for their thoughtful contribution to this worthy cause.
The Watauga Democrat, January 1918.
Throughout the rest of their days, Susie supported its residents with money, Christmas gifts, food, and clothing. Susie's first recorded interest in making a lasting institutional contribution to community health care, she and W.W. contributed $100 each toward the effort to build and equip a first-class hospital in Boone, a neighboring community. Ever faithful to their religious convictions, the Stringfellows contributed to the construction of a building for the Baptist Church in Blowing Rock in 1905, while attending the Episcopal Church of the Holy Spirit, where Susie served as treasurer and taught Sunday school. And although childless, the couple patronized the education and development of young people. In 1914, they organized the first Blowing Rock Boy Scout troop, hosting troop meetings at Chitola. Susie co-founded a local branch of the Campfire Girls and organized the Blowing Rock School Betterment Association. The ever-colorful W.W. built and equipped a movie theater in the village in 1914 that guaranteed free admission twice a week for young people to see moving pictures of instructive character, and not the dime novel kind. For the greater community, Susie co-founded the Blowing Rock Civic Improvement League and the Blowing Rock Exchange, a craft center for residents to sell their wares. W.W. was also active in civic improvements in Watauga County. He became Commissioner of Roads in the county, and calling on his experience as treasurer of the Alabama State Fair, he took charge of the Watauga County Fair in 1912. But that same year, his health began to falter again, prompting a trip to Baltimore to see a specialist. While he was there, Susie developed appendicitis and underwent emergency surgery. Afterward, her health issues settled down for a few years, and W.W.'s gradually improved. By 1913, it was back to business as usual, entertaining lavishly in both their homes and championing even more civic and charitable causes. They continued encouraging farming, beautification, and other outdoor endeavors by organizing several grand conferences for Blowing Rock citizens and giving away dahlia bulbs and other plants. In the fall of 1914, Susie wrote to the Watauga Democrat with details of the Civic League's contest for the most attractive yard and best displays of flowers and plants. She had become the unofficial horticulturist of Watauga County.
There are very few cottage owners in our mountains who do not display a love of flowers, but more should be done to encourage the tree planting as well as the cultivation of blooming things. What has been done in Blowing Rock can be accomplished in all parts of the country, and I hope there will be so many applications for Chitola plants and cuttings that the rural delivery man will have to ask for additional means of transportation.
Susie also believed firmly that the restoration of WW's health in North Carolina was an act of God, and she wanted to thank and praise him by building a new Episcopal church in the village. Underwritten by a $10,000 donation from the Stringfellows, that's $170,000 in today's money. Workers laid the cornerstone of Stringfellow Memorial Church in 1918 on Main Street. But Susie's aspiration for building the church would echo her father's experience with Parker Memorial. She would not be there for the dedication. For several years, Susie had suffered recurring health setbacks from Bright's disease, a chronic inflammation of the kidneys that proved fatal to her 38-year-old Uncle Jacob Parker back in 1885.
Mr. and Mrs. Stringfellow started for Alabama in their handsome car, with friend Ed Minton as chauffeur, and got as far as Spartanburg when Mrs. Stringfellow became quite ill. So they put up for a while, sending the car home and expecting themselves to go on by rail.
The Watauga Democrat, October 1915.
Ironically, the sparsely populated mountains of North Carolina that had cured WW proved too dangerous for Susie. She needed quality health care close by. She needed to come home to Anniston. In summer 1919, they sold Chitola for $30,000. That's about $500,000 today, and packed up for good.
Owing to the poor health of Mrs. Stringfellow, she and her husband decided to sell the estate, which is one of the prettiest in all this beautiful country and is admired by all persons who visit the Blowing Rock section.
The Lenore News, June 20th, 1919.
On their way home, Susie fell ill again, forcing her to convalesce for several days at the Carlheim Hotel in Lenore, North Carolina. With a nurse at her side, she finally made it home in early August. The company town that grew up with 50-year-old Susie was now a bustling center for banking and industry in East Alabama, and home to Camp McClellan, a large Army cantonment that had trained soldiers for the Great War. Its population was 17,000. Never one to rest or to live frugally, WW immediately began construction of a new dream home for his bride. He chose the site northeast of downtown on Layton Avenue. The hillside property was originally home to the Noble Institute for Boys, which fire had destroyed in 1910. Susie named the new estate Amicenza, Italian for friendship.
I had a deep affection for the Italian architecture we saw in our travels and desired to replicate that atmosphere in Anniston. I envisioned a large reception room where we could greet our guests when we entertained, and a grand terrace overlooking gardens of blooming varieties of all kinds of flowers and vines. And of course, there would be trees, so many trees. But what is a mountain view without them?
During the fall months, Susie's health improved as she watched her new home rise on the hill and heard reports from Watauga on the progress of the church construction. But her diseased body could not rally long, and her health spiraled downward again as the new year approached. News of the sudden death of her sister Lily on January 15th could only have worsened her state. Lily, 49, was in New York visiting her sister Minnie, who had remarried in 1910 to F.E. Hagemeyer. After the sisters had lunched at a local restaurant, Lily suffered a heart attack while walking home. Susie's own mortality loomed large in her thoughts, and her dreams of Amicenza began to change. It would not be a place for her to stroll garden paths and enjoy temporal blooming things. It would be a place for comfort and healing for others.
winter climate, even at its worst, can be defied by the patient efforts of a flower-loving woman.
On February 7, 1920, just 3 weeks after Lily's death, Susie closed her eyes for the last time, but her vision remained strong to the end. Just 5 days before, with her nurse as one of the witnesses, she had dictated from her deathbed a handwritten will that reflected the real legacy that she wanted to leave.
In 1920, she wrote her will, and then 5 days later, at the age of 51, she died. And her will said that her estate should be set aside for a hospital for Anniston. You know, the fact that she picked health as the cause, I think, has more to do with the fact that her mother and her brother died. Her brother died at a very early age of pneumonia, and her mother died soon after, having cared for him night and day, and that her husband had health issues, and so she knew the importance of good physical health to others, and that's why she chose that.
Upon W.W. Stringfellow's death in 1932, the property and estate assets were placed in the Susie Parker Stringfellow Charitable Trust. Stringfellow Memorial Hospital began operating on the site in 1938.
You know, I think that she was a woman who didn't get to, for whatever reason, fulfill, her role as a mother. And so she chose to be a mother to her community with the free kindergartens, with the establishment of the hospital, through her will. All of those things, are evidence of a person who cared about the place that she had come to call home.
She looked out for others with her dying breath, and we see the benefits of that stewardship and that shepherding today with just the magnificent multiplication of the Stringfellow Foundation and the Community Foundation over 100 years.
Her selfless act of philanthropy has touched the lives of literally millions of people.
Determined to be a power for good, she defied winter. She planted her tree. The Susie Parker Stringfellow Charitable Trust is now known as the Community Foundation of Northeast Alabama. The Community Foundation of Northeast Alabama's mission is to achieve positive change through the generosity of donors now and for generations to come. Since inception, over 200 funds have been added to the Community Foundation. Each fund has its own charitable purpose and awards either grants or scholarships according to the donor's intent.
She cared enough about her community to do something with her estate that changed the course of history.